Hello, my name is Paige, and I am presenting my argument for debate 3 on side B that the United Nations is not an effective tool for the protection of human rights at an international level. So basically, what I want to argue is that the structure of the United Nations, in particular the Security Council, is the reason for the ineffectiveness at protecting human rights, just because there's a lot of, I don't know if bureaucracy is the right word, but basically bureaucracy, red tape. It's basically a democratic process where certain members can veto actions, and that way certain resolutions and sanctions can be stopped. So the United Nations Security Council is made up of 15 members. 5 of those are permanent. They've been there since the creation of the organization. And then there's 10 other members that obviously represent countries around the world, and they're elected for 2-year terms. So basically, it's kind of this general setup where we start to run into problems. There's been criticisms of the 5 permanent members, who include China, France, the United States, Russia, and the United Kingdom. It's basically been argued that this group, these nuclear powers, form sort of an elitist club where they go and they will, draft resolutions, sanctions based on what they think are issues occurring in the world, to see human rights violations. Issues are obviously going to pertain to them, but they can also have other issues brought to their attention. So it's been argued that sometimes this group will draft resolutions, sanctions, that sort of thing, and then try to just propose them to the rest of the Security Council for either ratification or veto. There's also been criticisms of the Security Council that it's undemocratic in its representation of worldviews during humanitarian crises, conflicts, especially when there's cases of human rights violations. This is basically just because the 5, nuclear powers hold a lot of political, economic, influential power in the world, and so basically, if they decide to take action, they have to be convinced that it's worth their time, and it's that it's something that's worth it for them to spend a lot of time and money to look into. And in the early days of the United Nations, it was almost immediately put to the test of, would this be an effective tool for protecting human rights because of the Cold War? So you have 2 members of the, 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the United States and Russia. They were conflicting, not in a physical war, but more of a conceptual, they were kind of just, hand on the trigger sort of thing with the Cold War. And, there were many human rights violations, especially in rising communist countries in South America, Central America, and parts of Europe, where there were egregious human rights violations, as we saw in the Vietnam War, with prisoners of war, that sort of thing, where the United Nations wasn't able to take action because when sanctions or resolutions were proposed, either Russia or the United States would veto them, and then they couldn't move forward from there. And let's see. So basically, this problem is where we're at today, is why the United Nations isn't effective at protecting human rights, because we see, scenarios like Israel, the Ukraine back in 2013 and 2014, and Syria present day, where we know that there are human rights violations going on. There are NGOs and other groups and, journalism where we have sources to prove that there are, egregious human rights violations occurring. So see, it's not hard to look through the news today and see articles about Palestine and Syria where people are being killed, civilians are dying, and, people are starving to death because they're being blockaded basically into small cities and areas of conflict. And really, there's no international aid going in because the United Nations isn't able to take action, because of other basically big players on the Security Council have vested interest in these areas. For example, Israel, the United States has always been, has widely backed Israel's actions in the Middle East because it's a stable democracy. It provides them with an ally in the region. So basically any United Nations sanctions against them, the United States has almost always vetoed, just to protect their own interests, and they see that the existence of Israel is a positive influence over the area. But in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Israel's killing lots of Palestinians, especially civilians, in conflicts that have occurred in that area over the years. Another area we see is Syria, where Russia is currently backing the Assad regime there, which is very oppressive and has been accused of using chemical warfare on its civilians, that sort of thing. And the United States is on the opposing side of that conflict, where they're trying to, free the country, try to establish a democracy, and basically any actions that are critical of the Assad regime, Russia will veto any, resolution sanctions against the opposing side in that conflict. The United States would likely veto or be against. We saw back in Ukraine, back in 2013, 2014, there's a lot of political unrest. And when Russia annexed Crimea, which was like a southeastern region of Ukraine, there was a lot of international pushback. So, and, calls for the United Nations to take action because there was a lot of conflict. People were disappearing, people were being tortured, kidnapped, that sort of thing. And so basically that came to a stalemate where the United Nations could take very little action because Russia Russia wanted Crimea and the Ukraine to be under their influence, and the United States wanted them to be free and to actually be able to make their own actions, that sort of thing. And finally, a good example of how the Security Council can be influenced by its permanent members is really just when any country sitting on that board, that in that council, has a vested economic, political, social interest in that country. Even especially economic, can come into play with resources. So, for example, the United Nations in the past, when conflicts have arose in Kuwait, Kuwait's a very resource-rich country, especially for oil. The United Nations has been able to take swift action to be able to resolve those issues, provide aid, that sort of thing. Whereas we see Rwanda, where Rwanda is a less resource-rich country, where there was very little attention at first from the United Nations, there was very little call to action, and then we see this genocide that we've been studying throughout the course kind of play out, and we kind of ask ourselves, why was there no action? And it just kind of demonstrates how these powers can really kind of be fickle when they come to trying to find resolutions for their country. They kind of put their own interests first, unless we've yet to see if they have a lot of pressure on them to act otherwise.